Father, thank you so much for this opportunity to take time out of our busy schedules and just reflect on your scriptures. And we know that these scriptures, they reveal truth, and we only know and see in part. Despite the wisdom and the depth of your revelation, still our minds struggle to understand the things that are beyond us. And so, Father, if we're going to understand this word that you inspired, that you gave these words through your Spirit to the people that write them, we're going to need your Spirit to illuminate our hearts and minds. Our minds can read words and think up ideas, but your Spirit has to inform our spirit in order for us to really get the meaning that you intend behind them. So that these words are not just words that fall on our ears, but they're a spiritual and powerful message that goes to our heart and transforms the way we see the world and the way we act and the way we love. And so, Father, our prayer is, as we work through these scriptures, that you would guide and instruct according to your Spirit. In the name of Christ Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, as we begin, I want to begin with a quotation from a famous Christian author, and then I'm going to get your reaction. This author says, "I don't want to force anyone to believe as I do, but neither will I allow anyone to deny me the right to believe that the last day is near at hand. For the history of the centuries that have passed since the birth of Christ nowhere reveals conditions like those of the present. There has never been such building and growth in the world. There has never been such indulgent and widespread eating and drinking as now. Clothing has never been more expensive. Has anyone ever heard of such commerce as now circles the globe? Young men in their 20s now know more than doctors formerly knew, to say nothing of all the new innovation." How many of you would agree with this author? Excellent. The author was Martin Luther, written in 1522. It has been true throughout the centuries that people felt like they were living in the last days. It's a commonality from even in the New Testament itself, this belief that they were living in the last days. And so Revelation has always been an intriguing book to people because of this constant sense that this is not right. There is something broken about this messed up world, and God's got to do something sooner rather than later. It's always been an intriguing book throughout the history of Christianity. And so as we begin our study on Revelation, I want to manage your expectations a little bit. So this is the part where you might not come back next week. But I want to make sure, I'm from the business world, so I want to manage expectations. So on the first level, I want to say quite plainly that I'm not going to tell you when Jesus is coming back. That's not going to happen. All right? So if you came here to find out the date on which Jesus returns, now you got to go. I'm not going to tell you who the Antichrist is. We're not going to have any identification piece. We're not going to tell you about China and Russia and all those things. That's really not what this text and this course is about. So that's one level of expectation I just want to lay out there. And sometimes what happens is we get into the book and people expected all that, and then they find out by week 3, apparently we're not getting this. And so they go find something else to do. So I'm telling you up front, we're not going to find the answers to those questions here. The other thing I would say to you is we're jumping into the deep end of the pool. This is not easy for beginners. I searched in vain for a commentary called Revelation for Dummies. I don't think there is such a one. And the reason is because the book is just filled with symbols and themes from history and Old Testament. It is a book that requires a lot of insight going in and exposure. There's a lot of inside the park language that you find all the way through this book. And if you're kind of lost a little bit, you're going to miss the meanings. And sometimes I'm afraid that what happens when we look at the book of Revelation, we go in there without that exposure to Old Testament and even intertestamental kind of history and theology and tradition. And we get in there and we start to lose track of the story. And so we invent a new story. And so I will say to you up front, we're going to have to jump into some pretty deep waters. So breathe deeply, get your sleep the night before. Snoring is punished in this class. So if you snore, you will be asked to find another place. So I just want to manage your expectations with regard to that. And finally, I want to also say something about different schools of thought. And we're going to touch a little bit of that this evening, but I want to say something up front. Sometimes I'm asked, do you have a textbook? And I'm going to say no. Now, I have ordered a sample that I'd like to look at and review, and maybe I can recommend it to you. But the problem is with commentaries is each one of them take a particular point of view on the book of Revelation. And depending on which view you take, that's going to color your commentary. And what I'm going to try to do in this course as much as possible is not take a position on a particular viewpoint on Revelation, but to study the text itself. Like, is to really look at the text, look at the symbols, look at the stories, and leave it to you to kind of sort through what makes sense to you. I have a point of view, but I will try really hard not to let you know what that is. But I'm not that good, so it may sneak out. I'm going to try to keep it as neutral as possible, because I think sometimes we miss the point of the text because we come to it already knowing what we're going to find there. And I would challenge all of us not to do that. Let's just say for a moment, let's suspend our preconceptions about what this book already means and really dig again and look at it for a first time at what the text may say. And as I said, hopefully I'll be able to at least give you a textbook that'll give you some, in a usable format, the different points of view. When I prepare this, I use certain commentaries, but they tend to be of a more technical, scholarly kind of orientation that really are not out there for easy consumption. So anyway, so having said all that and trying my best to manage your expectations, let's go ahead and jump in. And as I said, we're jumping into the deep end of the pool, so we are going to jump right in with Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. And for the purposes of this course, we're going to mostly stick with the New International Version of the Bible. It's the Bible you find in your pews, so you can pull that out and read through it. From time to time, we'll use other translations, and I'll let you know when that happens. The first thing we need to do when we approach this book, right out of the box, we have this reference to the author. And so in Revelation 1:1, we have this revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. We don't really have a lot of technical detail. There are a few historical details that we're going to get a little later in the letter, but we don't have a label. We don't have an identifying characteristic of this person other than his name is John. In that same chapter, a couple verses later, we have this introduction to the letter. John, to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. When we first got email around here, I used to just sign my letters in his name or in his service, Dirk, my little email at the bottom. And then I got lectured. Don't just say that because nobody knows who you are. Like, don't send out an email, who's Dirk? And so they made me invent a little thing at the bottom that says Dirk Rogers, pastor, Bethany Church, phone number, all this stuff. In this letter written, John doesn't go into a lot of detail about who he is. It's almost as if the people who were receiving that letter knew who John was. And so the question is, who is this John? Well, he writes to these 7 churches in the province of Asia. And so I give 4 possible answers there that have been tried historically about the author. The majority position and the position that we adopt in this class is that it was John the Apostle, one of the original 12, the same John that wrote the Gospel of John, and the same John who we believe wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So one John who wrote all 5 of these books, a sizable chunk of material in the New Testament. So in the course we just finished called Who Wrote the New Testament, we go into this in more detail. But overall, that seems to be the position of the early church. If you look at the writers in the first 2 or 3 centuries after the death of Christ, they are fairly unanimous with this belief that it was John the Apostle who wrote this. There are a couple other suggestions that are brought forth from time to time. There is one particular author in the early church that begins to talk about this individual named John the Presbyter or John the Elder. There's not necessarily a biblical reference to him that we can find, but there was this assumption that there somewhere in Ephesus and in Asia Minor, where John the Apostle was, there was another John named John the Elder, and maybe he wrote this particular book. So there's one mention of this in the ancient writings, and from time to time there is someone who jumps on that bandwagon and says that this particular person did it. We don't have any evidence about who this is. We don't have any evidence about what he may have done. It's just that there is one writer, who mentioned that this is a possibility. And also, it seems if you go to this area of Ephesus, there are 2 tombs dedicated to the Apostle John. And physics tells us that either they're divided or they're one or the other. And so the rumor began to circulate that maybe there was another John in that area. So it's a minority position, but some people have it. Still others look at this text and they notice that the Greek that this letter was written in is kind of more symbolic, more rough, more edgy than the polished Greek that you find in the Gospel of John. And so the thought is, well, maybe it's John, but a different John, a John we never heard of before. Just some John, but there's enough difference in the Greek, so it's argued that it probably is a different person. Those who still believe that John the Apostle have reasons for that. I mean, it's a different kind of literature. It's a revelation from God. There are a lot of symbols, a lot of allusions to the Old Testament that may have inspired this. I mean, after all, this person is claiming to have seen God and seen all these visions. I don't know about you, but sometimes that's not when I'm the most articulate. When I see these things, it's not when I carefully polish my words. So perhaps this is more of a reaction. But some people would say that maybe it's a different John. And of course, there are critical scholars out there that doubt whether John wrote it at all. You may actually, if you're a PBS person and you watch PBS or one of these other places and they get Dr. So-and-so from such and such a university, they'll explain to you that Revelation was not written in the 1st century. It was written in the 2nd or the 3rd century, and it was written by people, not John, somebody else. They'll tell you, but that's a critical view. It's out there. Not evangelicals, conservatives don't believe that, but I don't want you to be shocked when you turn into one of these shows on television and they tell you that. There is this attempt to say that it was written much later. But again, that's a different course, a different argument, but for purposes of interpreting the work, we're going to state with the majority position in what is by far the most ancient tradition, that this was in fact written by John, the writer of the gospel. Now, when was this written? Well, again, there are a couple different theories, and it's your decision as to which one you want to go with is going to be determined by a couple different factors. One is that it was written later, and this is, again, the majority view, and probably not just the majority view in our century, but a majority view from the very beginning. We have this particular view mentioned by a church scholar by the name of, or church father by the name of Irenaeus, who was actually a church leader in what we now know as the southern portion of France, is Gaul. He actually, as early as 180 or 200 AD, so within 150 or 60 years of the middle of that 1st century, he was writing, and he claims that it was written under this particular emperor by the name of Domitian. And in Domitian's time, we find that there is a widespread persecution of the church. Early on in the development of Christianity, Christians and Jewish people kind of got classed together, and so the Romans in general were trying to deal with Christianity as just a particular influence of Judaism or a particular cult of Judaism. And so it was kind of a part of their larger approach to the issue of Judaism, not just in Jerusalem and Palestine, but throughout the entire Asia Minor area, throughout the empire. But right about the time of when you start getting into the 60s and the 70s, and especially after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, you have an increased pressure on Christians as a particular group, apart from Judaism, and it really comes to a head under this person Domitian. And so the idea is that this was probably written right in the middle of that persecution. That was probably when John was exiled to this island of Patmos. It makes the most sense in terms of the history and the symbolism that we find. And so that's the view that we're going to take here. Now, there is another view out there that it was done around 70 AD. And for those of you who know something about Roman history and Jewish history, 70 AD is a crucial year in the development of Judaism. That's the year in which the temple is destroyed again. You remember the temple that Solomon built was destroyed in 587, 586 BC by the Babylonians. It remained destroyed until it was rewritten, rebuilt in the closing days of the New Testament. So that temple has been around for 400 or 500 years, and over the years it was getting expanded, and in the time of Jesus it's actually is getting expanded larger than it ever was, even in the days of Solomon. So there was a tremendous growth of that temple in the time of Jesus. But then in the days of when Titus became kind of the general that was sent to quell rebellion there among the Jewish people, he actually destroyed that temple for a second time, and that temple has not been rebuilt to this day. In fact, if you look at current records of or videos of Jerusalem, you see what's called the Wailing Wall, where people stand against it and pray against that Wailing Wall. That is what is remaining still from that temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. So obviously for the history of Judaism, that's a critical year. And there's a particular school of thought about Revelation that those events that are in those symbols in Revelation are all about that event. In other words, they're telling us about that destruction of the temple. And so the folks from that point of view believe that this was written early. It was written right around the time of the destruction of the temple, and maybe even before the temple was destroyed, as a prophecy about what was happening, or shortly after as a reflection on what had just happened. So if you're of that particular interpretation of Revelation, that it's about the history, about the past, they would argue for this earlier date. Where most of the folks who see that, no, this is after. The symbols are what took place after the destruction of that temple. And so that's really what divides the two schools. Again, we're going to stick with the majority view that was written later. But again, we'll show you why this becomes an issue and where the tension arises in the text as we walk through. All right. Any questions about the author or the date? This is the boring part. Don't worry, it won't be on the test. It'll be fun. So now let's get back to the meat and the meaning, all right? And so we have here this opening statement, the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. That word revelation is actually the Greek word that we take the word apocalypse. So sometimes the book of Revelation is called the apocalypse. And this is where that word comes from. It is simply a word that means revelation. I mean, that's what it means. And the NIV translates it that way. Sometimes, though, in the literature of the day, that word takes on a little more intensity. It kind of talks about a particular kind of revelation. It's not just a revelation of words, it's an intense revelation of visions and symbols. It's meant to be impactful, it's meant to be stirring, it's meant to be intense. so that your experience of it, you're not just listening to words and the truth is being revealed to you through a lecture. The idea is that when you see an apocalypse, it's an emotionally driven, charged message. You're not supposed to be able to just sit there and say, well, that was nice. Recently, my wife and I were able to go and see a concert with Andrea Bocelli. I don't know if you know him, but it was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. And you'd go there, and he had 3 guest stars that were sopranos. And you'd listen to these voices, and they had them on this giant screen. So you'd see the faces up there on the stage, but then you'd see these giants, and you'd hear this voice, and you were just transformed. This was not just listening to the radio. I mean, this was an experience. It was, revelation is meant to be, apocalypse is meant to be one of those kind of revelations, where you engage in it, not just intellectually, but emotionally and physically and visually, so that you experience revelation, you just don't listen to it. And so I think that's the notion that this is being carried here. Apocalypse is this intensification of prophecy. Now, as I said, we have a little bit of a problem here. Because as we go to approach this book, people approach it with different presumptions, different expectations, different frameworks. And so I want to let you know what those frameworks are. And then, as I said, I'm going to challenge us to set those frameworks aside and really just dig into the text. But just so you're aware, these are the typical ways. Now, that first version that I have there is called a preterist. Those of you who are grammatical people and English language specialists and have your Latin down know that preter talks about that which is accomplished, that which is finished. And so the idea is that this is past. So the concept is that the discussions, the symbols, the historical revelation, it's all about something that's already accomplished in our day. And so there are commentaries written where people have argued about all those things about, for example, the 666, the Antichrist, that's about Nero. And so that's over, that's done. The temple is destroyed. And so we're talking about something in the past tense. And so there are many commentaries written in that particular place. In some cases, it goes a little bit further, and they said it's actually about events that kind of end when the Roman Empire ends, which, if you know your history, was in the 5th century, when finally the empire crumbled. And it was about the prediction of the fall of the Roman Empire. So there's nothing in Revelation, according to this particular school, which is about the future, from our perspective. From our perspective, it's already done, completed, fulfilled. And so there are folks who believe that way. There's another group of scholars and commentaries that look at history, the book of Revelation, as being a story of the succession of history. In other words, it's still prophecy. It looks forward from the point of view of John. That is, he's looking forward, but he's seeing different periods in church history. And people go and look at that, and they look back across that, and they find, interestingly enough, they're embedded in the book of Revelation, stories of the early church. And if you look hard enough, according to this school, you find the medieval papacy and the medieval Catholic Church in this particular book that molds into the Protestant Reformation. Other people find references to Napoleon trying to take over Europe. Even others who see Hitler in this particular work. It seems to fit up nice with that whole Antichrist model. And so some scholars actually have tried to look at the Revelation and see all these different church ages spelled out. In fact, sometimes they even find it in the letters to the churches. They look at each of the letters to the churches and say, well, this is a representative of the medieval church or the Reformation church. And so they try to do it that way. So that's one point of view. Again, when we walk through them, I'll leave it to you to decide whether that makes sense or not. But just so you know, that view is out there. And some people have gone with that approach. Most of us, I suspect, are of this third category, which are futurists. And the idea is that the majority of the book chapters 4 through 22, are about things still to come. How many of you are from that background? You believe that this book is mostly about the future, right? So most of you come from that background. That tends to be the evangelical conservative understanding. And this particular group kind of divides itself into two classes. And by the way, it's not like you go to school and get a label. These are labels that nobody agrees on. These are just categories I kind of put together. You can go look at the commentaries, and one group will have this name and that name and the other name. This is my attempt to kind of sift through all that scholarly stuff and give you some categories that kind of make sense. And of course, there are people that it's hard to pin down. So these are generalities. They're not technical terms by any sense, but it kind of gives you an idea of the different approaches. And most folks in this evangelical group, they would fall into this former group of futurists. It's what we call dispensational futurism. Again, I'm sorry, but you're jumping into the deep end of the pool, right? So there are words, big words here. Hopefully, as we go on, we'll talk about the scriptures. There'll be less big words, but I just have to start off with the big words, right? And I won't bore you with all the detail of what this means, except to say that there's a particular school in theology that began to emerge in the 19th century, primarily, some would argue earlier, of course, but it became very popular here in this country in the 1800s and early 1900s, and it kind of carried forward. And the thought there is that the history of the Bible should be divided into a series of dispensations or covenants with God's people. And right now, according to that particular understanding of the Bible, we are in what they call the church age. And we're going through that particular segment. And Revelation is about the next stage, what's coming next. And so that particular school of thought tends to be very literal and physical about this particular book. So they really see these symbols as representing things yet to take place. So, for example, they believe in the physical restoration of Israel. Like this is about the actual restitution of the nation of Israel, as yes, we know it today. Also, that there's going to be the whole Tim LaHaye Left Behind. Remember that whole series? That's from that group of folks who have this idea of rapture, that we're all going to be driving down the highway and the bus driver's going to go and oops, like that kind of school of thought. That's where most of us come from. That there's this literal 7 years of tribulation. And then we argue about whether it comes before the 7 years, in the middle of the 7 years, at the end of the 7 years. We have that argument. And then this idea that there's going to be a literal 1,000 years. All right? How many of you come from that background? Yeah. See, that's the majority tradition in most evangelical schools. What began to happen is this idea of dispensationalism got picked up and by some of the early conservative movements. And so you had schools like Dallas Theological Seminary who picked up this particular view of how the Bible ought to be interpreted. And so that view kind of got built into a lot of conservative evangelical circles early on and spread through those early development of Protestantism and Christianity here. So most of the evangelical tradition has been exposed to this particular teaching, and most of us are there. But what I'm pointing out to you here, and we're going to look at that as a possibility, and again, I'm not going to try to judge one way or another. We're just going to kind of lay out the possibilities here. But what I'm trying, for those of us that come from that background, all I'm trying to say to you is there are other possibilities that other people think about. And what we're going to do here is look at other possibilities as well as this possibility. So we just want to be aware of that context. There's another kind of less intense view of futurism that says, yes, there is a substantial amount still left in Revelation about the future, but we need to be less insistent upon the specifics, like the specifics of the 7 years or the 1,000 years. There's other options here that could be considered. And so it's a modified view of futurism. So that's another take that we sometimes have, a less literal interpretation of numbers and signs. And then we have yet another group or school of thoughts, idealist group. Now, this is a group that it says, sometimes we look at Revelation and we think it's all about what's going to happen or what has happened historically. But what if the book is not about that per se, as much as it's about the history and the principles and the theology and the eternal realities that are out there? So that it's really not about an unfolding of time per se, it's about an unfolding of an eternal will of God in the middle of all this. And so it's about truth and about grace and about what has happened eternally, not just about what is happening in time. And so we have a group which I've called idealists. Different people have different names for it, and we'll look at those as we go. But that's the thought, that maybe it's not so much telling us what was or what is to come literally on earth. It's telling us what's already occurred in heaven, and then based upon what's happening eternally, we can interpret all the ages of the church, wherever we are. Perhaps that's a possibility. And then there's this other group, loosely coupled, of thinkers who believe that it's not just totally idealism. There are some future ideas here. They're kind of like those modified futurists. They're in there somewhere, that this may be about eternal truth and timeless truth, but there is some components in here that tell us something about how this history is going to end. So I just wanted to point out to you, and I'm sorry to give you all the details and all the technicalities and the scholarly stuff, but it seems to me as we began this process, I want you to know, A, there are multiple approaches and multiple frameworks, and B, I wanted you to be aware to say, oops, I found myself there. I know where I fit in all this, and what do you mean there are other possibilities? I thought there was only one. And what I want to say, no, there are many, and all of them start with the Scripture, and our desire is to be faithful to the Scriptures and how we unfold them, all right? And that's really the point in this next slide. Nothing short of the careful exegesis of the text, uninhibited by prior dogmatic conclusions, is required for the fullest understanding of the apocalypse. And that's what I'm asking us to do here. Let's just set aside our frameworks for a moment and let's really dig into the text and ask the questions, what does this mean historically, without assuming we know the answer? I've been teaching the Scriptures for a long time now, and I can tell you that my joy in this is that the Scriptures always surprise me. Just when I think I understand, God takes me to another level of understanding. It's like this refreshment of water, this refreshment spring that never goes out, the Spirit that always illuminates. And so I always have this, when you feel like you're really sure, take another look. In my seniors class, we're going through looking at Galatians, and I can't tell you how many times I've read through and taught the book of Galatians. I got to tell you, I'm finding that book at a whole different level of meaning and really stirring understanding grace in ways I've never seen before. I liken the Scriptures to a diamond with a million facets, This thing just sparkles. And you can look at it, and no matter how long you look at it, new facets will come forward. And I will tell you that the book of Revelation has a million squared facets. That when you look at it, you can just look at that beautiful image, and it continues to get deeper and richer and more motivating until you get to the place where John is, where it's an apocalypse. It's not just me taking notes in a class. I'm experiencing a symphony. I'm experiencing a concert. This is a emotion-driven, fact-driven, life-changing, altering vision, and that's really what we're after here, notwithstanding the boring class sitting in a sanctuary, right? We're trying to make it living and alive, and I will tell you, if we take a fresh look at the Scriptures, they will not disappoint. Now, a couple other kind of preparatory ideas as we begin to dig into the text. Every time you deal with Revelation, you get into this tension. Do we take it literally or symbolically? Right? Are these literal years, literal images, literal horses on horseback. What are we doing here? When do we do literal and when do we do symbol? And what I would suggest is it's not a matter of literal or symbolic. It's always a matter of both and. It is both literal and symbol at the same time. Symbols are not necessarily not literal. When you see a symbol, you know that it's meant to suggest something. So when we turn here and look at the American flag, that's a symbol. But we know what that means. That's a literal statement. That's saying something about history and about freedom and about our commitment to freedom. Symbol can be very literal. It can say something very, very true and very, very precise. And I would say we always do that kind of talk, right? We talk about the fact that we're blind to a particular truth. Now, are we literal? No, because truth is something we imagine, but we know what we're saying. We're talking about a blindness of the mind. And so we use symbols like that to stand for other symbols. Words by themselves are symbols. They're symbols of meaning. Symbols mean different things in different cultures. For example, the word flat. If we say the word flat in this country, we think we had a problem getting to work today because something happened to our car. If we say the word flat in Britain, it means where we were living on the way to work. It's our apartment. The word is the word, but the meaning depends upon the culture. And so what I would say to you is that these words themselves are symbols. And these images that God uses as symbols, and again, this is apocalypse, so it's meant to be visually stirring. And I would say to you, it's never a matter of should we interpret this literally or should we interpret this symbolically. It's more a matter of when and how. There are symbols all the way through it. So it's not a matter of whether it's a symbol, it is a symbol, or it is a word. It's what does that symbol mean? How do we interpret it? And so I think that argument about whether it's literal or symbol is it's a code for something else. It's a code for which camp do you fall in. And rather than go to that place, I'd rather say, well, it is a symbol and it is literal. What does the symbol mean? Let's not fight that battle of either or. And it's a matter of not whether whether a symbol is introduced, but when it is introduced. Its symbols are all over this book, and you can't interpret it literally from end to end as if there are no symbols. It's just a matter of when it's going to occur and how to interpret. And we see that all over the place. There are images. It applies to images. It refers to types. There are all kinds of borrowing from the Old Testament. One words, like the word Babylon appears. Well, what does that stand for? I mean, Babylon as an empire was pretty much gone by the time of Jesus. But obviously when it's being used as a type of something. So a type of what? That's really where the discussion begins. In Numbers, the number 7, the number 1,000. These are symbols. Now, do they refer to a literal 7 years, or does the 7 years refer to, are they a symbol of something else? These are all things that we'll have to sort through and see what makes sense. But the reality is these symbols, they fly all the way through the nature of apocalypse. That's what they are. And so we'll have to do that. Notice this text we've taken from Revelation 1 and 2 here. It says, the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants. The word there is visible. In other words, these are meant to be things you see. They're visual representations, almost like you see art, right? And art sometimes it's meant to give a visual impact. It's not always about precise scientific language, it's art, right? And so I remember one time I was in our fine arts class I think it was my freshman year of college. And I went to school outside Nyack College. It was right outside of New York City. We took a bus into the Museum of Fine Art. And there I was, with all my wisdom coming from Western Pennsylvania farmland, going into New York City at the Museum of Fine Arts. And we were looking through art, and there was this, I remember this one particular piece of art. It was a black box like this. And we came back and we had to have a conversation. You have to talk about these. And I remember I wasn't as hopefully wise as I am now. I actually said what I thought in those days, which was not good. And I remember saying to my professor, like, I'm trying to be understanding here, but I don't get it. Like, how is that black box art? And so she proceeded to tell me and explain to me that it's what you feel and what you experience. And I would say to you that right here in the text, and I didn't want to tell her what I was really experiencing, but that I was wise enough to know at least that. This is meant to be like he's meant to show. These are visions, these are images. And so by the very definition of how God chose to reveal to John, we see symbol. It's the very definition of what happened. It's an image that's supposed to suggest. So in our attempt to say, what does this mean? We're going to want to be scientifically precise. And we have to ask, is that really the point here? Is he trying to suggest a picture here? And it is to show this. And this showing is a made it known. That is, it is a revelation. There is some truth being communicated through these images. And that's the challenge of Revelation. We're trying to interpret symbols and pictures and images and references and types. And also, John testifies to everything he saw. Sometimes when I teach, I encourage about New Testament, I present an image, and we're not going to do the homework here because you guys didn't pay the big bucks, so you don't get the homework. But I'd have them describe an image and show them a colorful spectacle that you'd see on the street, just whatever it might be, a parade, and ask the class to summarize it. And then we read each other's accounts. And what you see is it's hard to summarize what you see in precise words. All that to say that that's what we have here. We have a record of a vision, which is revelation, which is God wants us to see. But this is John giving a witness of what he saw. The revelation to him was this vision, which now he records and put down some words. So we're always trying to listen to him and try to get a picture in our mind of what he's saying. So I always tell folks when they interpret the scripture, it's good to have a good imagination. To get into there and not to invent truth. We're not about inventing truth. But obviously by the very nature of the revelation, there's a picture being described. What is that picture? And we have to try to do that, especially as we're working through Revelation. Now, lastly, I want to say a couple words about, I say lastly, but we're only about halfway through, so that's not lastly. Old Testament. One of the reasons why the book of Revelation is jumping into the deep end is because this is filled with Old Testament allusion. You can't read the book of Revelation without every other word, every other phrase, every other account is pulling from the Old Testament. And so the vast majority of what we're going to do through this study is talking about that. Because in its essence, the book of Revelation is giving us the epilogue, if you will, of the entire scriptures. The whole point of it is to tell you what the bottom line is, what the summary is, what the big meaning is. Think about for a moment the context. What we have here is a situation where these people believed in Jesus. They believed he was the Messiah. They believed he was the fulfillment of everything they hoped and dreamed about. He was going to be the one that was going to restore the people of God. And here we are, if our interpretation is correct, some 60 years from the death of Jesus. And Rome is still in power. The temple is now destroyed. The Jewish people are still oppressed. People are dying. And you've got to imagine there are people in the church that are saying, did we misunderstand the story somehow? This is not how we thought the story was going to turn out. I thought Jesus was the Messiah. I thought he was the conqueror. I thought this was what's going on here. And it is in the context of this, surely this condition of doubt, these circumstances that would cause any of us to doubt. I mean, you and I doubt if we don't get a job. We're like, oh, I don't believe in God anymore. He didn't deliver a job. I mean, these people, like, their history didn't change. I think in the midst of that crisis, God reaches out to reveal to John a revelation about what all this means. All the story of the Old Testament, all the stories of the history. And the question comes up, well, God, why is there 2,000 years of history here? Why do we have to go through all Babylon and Persia and Assyria? And why do we have to, in Rome? What is the point of all this? God, what are you doing? What's the purpose? What's the meaning? What's the destination? Well, that's the context in which God says, let me tell you what this story means. All those themes, all those threads, all those ideas, that's what that means. And I think that's really the point of this book of Revelation. And so to really understand it, you have to understand all those themes that emerge out of it. Look at this. This gives us a little bit of a detail underneath that idea. This is some text that comes from an introduction that I used when I was in seminary on the book of Revelation. Look what this text says. It says, the author has drawn most from the books of Daniel, Ezekiel, and to a lesser degree, Zechariah. So those three prophets feature prominently in this book, and we're going to have occasion to go back to them often. But in his mind was also saturated with other parts of the Old Testament, particularly Isaiah, whose words are reflected more than any other, Jeremiah, Joel, Exodus, and the parallels with the plagues. Indeed, so basic is the Old Testament. Listen to this fact. Indeed, so basic is the Old Testament to the writer's mental concepts that out of the 404 verses in the entire book, there are only 126 which contain no allusion to it. So, slightly more than 25%, around 75% of the book is Old Testament. Welcome to the book of Revelation. Do you see now why you're going to be in the deep end of the pool? 75% of this book is Old Testament. And so we're going to have to sort through that if we're going to understand the meaning of Revelation, because it is the summation of the whole point of the story from the perspective of this New Testament church. Let's just look at one example here of how that works, and we'll dig into this a little bit later. There are allusions here that are very, very emphatic. Look at this one. In Revelation 1:1, we just read this text, right? We all read it, and it seemed pretty straightforward. The revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his servants what must soon take place. Seems like a pretty straightforward statement. It's just an introduction. And yet again, if you have an Old Testament understanding, if you're immersed in the Old Testament and you had a firm grasp of it, immediately you would say, I've heard that before somewhere. This is not a new story. This is ringing a bell in my ears. And so, sure enough, we go back into this vision that Daniel had, a similar kind of vision. And it starts this way, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known what will be in the latter days. So this same idea that this God is revealing this mystery, and he has made it known, which God gave him to his servants. But in Daniel's day, it's what will happen in the later days, the latter days. But when we see this reference in Revelation, which will soon take place. See, you miss that whole subtle distinction if you're not aware of Daniel. And so there is that idea that in every word, in every phrase, there is these Old Testament allusions. And that's why I would say it's such a delight to do this book. You can't ever read it again and without going, aha, wait a minute, I remember that. And you start reading Isaiah and you're saying, oh, now I get it. And this is one of the things I love about the scriptures, is that God did it this way. Let me give one more let me just give one more thought. Part of the challenge here is that when you're trying to read through these allusions, you start to try to parse them and isolate them, but I don't know, how many of you ever been to the Sistine Chapel and looked up and seen the work on the ceiling, and it's amazing, right? And you look and you see how one theme flows into the other theme, and you look at this and you realize all of a sudden there must be an artist, right? Like, this doesn't happen randomly. When you read a book like Revelation, you begin to see that this Bible, an artist painted this. It was not random. It was not fragmented. There's a beautiful painting being painted here, and the themes are being woven together into this beautiful tapestry. That's really what you're seeing in Revelation, is this beautiful tapestry of themes being interwoven one with the other. That's the view that we have here in terms of trying to sort this out. Now, one of the things that makes that so challenging is that there are different types of allusions. And often, this is what we're discussing as we work through these. Sometimes it's pretty clear. Like, the wording is almost identical to the Old Testament source. It's a clear allusion, shares some common core meaning, and what could not likely have come from anywhere else. So we look at a text like this and we compare it to Daniel and we say, well, that's pretty clear. That's coming right from there. And we're going to see many occasions where there's clearly a reference to the Old Testament here. It's almost word for word done. In fact, some of the explanations as to why the Greek seems a little messed up in the New Testament is because they're just they're translating from what was the Old Testament in Hebrew into Greek, and so it's a little different. So there are some times where it's going to be clear, even to us, that this is borrowing from the Old Testament. There are other things that are probable allusions that we're not so sure what that means, but we're pretty clear that it's some sort of Old Testament idea. I would say Babylon is one of those. Like, we know this is some sort of symbol. We're not sure of what, but it's clearly a reference to the Old Testament something, because Babylon is one of those themes that go all the way through the Old Testament. I mean, you start seeing that. You remember Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham comes from. That's from the land of Babylon. And Babylon keeps showing up in the story in different ways, in different areas, until finally it becomes this land that comes and takes over and conquers Israel. So now you read the story of the New Testament and Babylon shows up again. But in what capacity? It's clearly a reference to something in the Old Testament, but what part, what idea, what thought? It's a probable allusion, we know that, but what's the precise nature? What exactly is it referring to? And then there are other things that scholars debate. Maybe it's an allusion, maybe it isn't, and we'll get to those as we go. But it seems to me like all the way through this text, there are allusions, and there's always this battle, this discussion that we have to have as we're understanding Revelation about whether or not and where the Old Testament story is being referred to. And we'll see ideas of that as we go. And then to just make things even more complicated, because it's not already complicated. Have I discouraged you yet from the study? Because that's the point. Yeah, so if I confuse you and disturb you enough, next time I'll come back and nobody will be here, and I'll just go home and read Revelation some more. You know? But I'm just trying to say, this is going to be a deep dive, but the rewards are endless. If you really go, it's when, Liz and I at one point we learned to snorkel. And so, you kind of go around on the top of the water and you look down and you see the little starfish and and it was pretty awesome. And then somewhere along the line, we decided we got to go deeper. And so we decided we were going to do the resort dive test thing. So we went in the pool and we went down there and we almost drowned in the pool and whatever. And somehow they said you were good enough. They put you in the boat and threw you down in the water. And once I almost died, but other than that, it was fine. And you go a little bit deeper and you see a little bit more. We never did quite the nerve to do what some of you have done, is actually get the certified and really go deep. And then you see, it takes work sometimes to get to the really deep parts. And the joy of the scriptures is it's not hard to get in the water. You start understanding. And even if you don't understand all the Old Testament, and even if you don't, you're going to get something out of this study. It's just those who are a little more exposed, they're going to get more. And that's why it's good to keep coming back. And I was just saying that some of that here is complicated by sometimes the mind and the visions, they're just so filled that they start mixing all these stories together. Like you have the plagues that are kind of language about the plagues mixed together with images that come centuries later in Babylon. And they're just shifting from, it's like, do you ever listen to one of those literary people just talk to you and refer to all these things? You're like, I have no idea what book he's talking from. Or I know which movie he's quoting from. They're just randomly, but to the people who know, see, that's going to happen. He's just going to mix these metaphors and mix these references and mix these symbols, and he kind of flows from one to the other, and he's going to kind of expect you to know that. But if we take the time to dig through these and understand them, the whole richness of the whole story comes to light. I often use the example of Downton Abbey, right? How many of you watched the Downton Abbey series, right? Yeah, my wife dragged me through that one. That was pretty exciting. So we had to watch all those like 5 times. It was great. So, the thing with that one is you could go in and you could watch one of those and you could kind of understand what's going on. But it really made sense if you watched the whole thing and you realize that guy, the reason he's doing that, because what happened in episode 2, you remember the time, and of course I'm only half paying attention. So I have to have my wife explain it to me for like 6 times. Like, what did that guy again, whatever? And so in the same way, when you study the book of Revelation, the more you know about the themes, the more this stuff starts to come together, because the author is weaving this tapestry of color and story. And so we're going to have to do that as we walk through this. All right, so I think I've hammered that nail enough times to let you know that the Old Testament is going to be pretty important here. Now let's talk about structure. I find this is an interesting quote from one of the sources I use. He says, "A blessing and curse of John's apocalypse are the many commentators who have attempted to interpret the book. This is especially true of the many outlines proposed for its literary structure. The diverse proposals are a maze of interpretive confusion." This is some guy who wrote, very smart, wrote a lot of commentary on this. He says, yeah, it's a mess. We don't understand. People who, you look at this book and you try to make it an outline. 1A, 1B, and the truth is, everybody has a different theory about how this book is organized. What's the structure? And let me just say up front, there's no right answer to this question. There just isn't. It's hard to outline a circle, You just can't do it. And that's really what we have here is, so, and those outlines are certainly going to be broken up according to your particular perspective on the book. So, having said that, the analogy I use is it's more a symphony than an outline. How do you outline a symphony? I mean, it's hard. It doesn't happen in a straight line. It's themes on top of themes, intermixing with themes. That's what the book of Revelation is all about. And so it's more outline than symphony. And if you experience this together, you get to see those themes just playing on one another, and they'll repeat themselves and get louder and then diminish, and you begin to see this brilliant picture emerge. And that's really the point of the book. And so how do you outline a symphony? Well, you don't. You try to describe it. And so one of those themes, for example, we're going to see here, if we try to talk about the structure of the theme, there are multiple themes that get repeated. Some of it is sevens. And so we have 7 letters, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. The number 7 keeps showing up. It's like that theme that keeps coming back in a symphony, that you keep hearing that 7. It's slightly different volume. Maybe the piccolos play it this time instead of the bassoon. But it's this idea of 7 that keeps coming back in different forms. What's going on there? What's that theme mean? We're trying to understand that. So whenever you do this structure, sometimes people sit down and say, well, we're going to organize it by the 7s. So we're going to start with the 7 letters, then we're going to go to the 7 seals. Oops, then you get to the 7, wait, when's the fifth, and then the sixth, and when's the seventh? Wait, oh darn, then the seals merge, and you're like, okay, that didn't work. Because you're trying to outline a symphony. I mean, it's the sevens are repeating, so you can't really outline it into the different groups of seven, because you can start that way, 7 churches, that's pretty clear, the letters are pretty, but then pretty soon that outlining by sevens, yeah, that starts to fall apart, because the themes start to repeat in the middle of them. So what is that all about? Well, then you have these themes that keep coming back and forth, this tension of God's glory on the one hand, this magnificent manifestation of the glory and power and majesty of God. It comes through over and over again, but it's never far removed from the other piece of this, which is God's Lamb. It's the Lamb that was slain. It's the suffering sacrifice. It's the saints that are suffering under the altar, the blood that's flowing. And so you have these contrasting themes of the glory of God magnified and angels singing, and this suffering and sacrifice and mixed together. We have judgment. This idea of God's going to judge and condemn, and this will be the end. And at the same time, you have these other things of persecution, that there are people being judged and they're in the middle of this persecution, but they're innocent. How does that fit together? And at the same time, when there's judgment and there's suffering, then there's this other theme of somehow reward comes in. You can almost feel the symphony start to build. Bang, 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 bang. You start to see, I hope that's not on the video, because that will not. It just got fired from that seminary job. All right, but you can see kind of the whole symphony building. That's the idea here. That's what we've got going. So how do you outline that? Well, you don't. You go with it. You roll through it. And then you have these, it's on different scenes. It's different backgrounds, different labels, and sometimes you kind of struggle as to where are we in the scene? At one point I thought it would be a good idea to get tickets to the Boston Ballet. It was like my wife and I, we needed to spend quality time. We were both in corporate, working way too many hours. And one of my mentors said to me, all right, by next week, I want you to tell me what you're doing to take your wife out, and I don't want any excuses. Don't come to me and tell me anything other than here are the tickets. So we went out, and I got us season tickets. Back in the day, we were making good money. I made season tickets to the Boston Ballet. I had no desire to go to the Boston Ballet at all. But I went, and it was awesome. And one of the things I loved about it is you'd go, and part of the story as it unfolded, not only were these men and women tremendous athletes that were just amazing to watch what they could do, I was like blown away by the beauty and the sheer athleticism and power and strength and precision of these people. But the story was told through manipulation of backgrounds, like you knew which scene you were in, and it was amazing how those scenes, part of the symphony here is understanding the background. What part of the glory and the majesty of this book is that it takes a place against these different scenes. This really is, I titled the story, where heaven, earth, and hell collide. I mean, that's really the story of Revelation. You have this magnificent themes of the throne of God, and this combination of the Holy of Holies and also the throne room of God combined into one image. This holy courtyard, if you will, as well as throne room, as well as altar place, center of the temple, like this combined complex image that's clearly an image of heavenly thrones. And then you have these earthly battles, this image of the temple, this people on earth dealing with these struggles. And then you have these images of the abyss where these creatures come out of the abyss to attack. I mean, this is like some sort of weird HBO miniseries thing going on here with these seasons, but much more dramatic and real. Like this is a powerful story. And so, again, while you're trying to outline this symphony, you got to take into account the fact that there are different scenes on which these stories unfold. So you got to fit that into your outline somewhere. And then, of course, underneath all of that, there is the tension between time and eternity. And this is one of the most underlying and most confusing parts, I think, of the entire book, is this tension between time and eternity. Now, eternity is something that you and I, we don't really think about that much. And it's hard to get our arms around it. Quite literally, eternity means no time. That's what it means, no time. And most of the time when we think of eternity, we think of everlasting. We mean like we're done here, it goes on forever. That's kind of true, but not really true. Eternity has nothing to do with time. It's beyond time. Time is not really a factor. In fact, sometimes I describe to people eternities like this. It's gone. It's already done. It's from another perspective. It has nothing to do with time. And so there's a very real sense in which, on one level, everything that Jesus did, everything that he wanted to accomplish, God's entire plan is already complete in eternity. It just hasn't been revealed in time. And so here, you and I, we're in time. We can only see in part and know in part. Those are Paul's words. And so part of what God is doing is revealing in time through his Son, through his prophets, through his word. He's revealing in time for you and I that are stuck in time. He wants us to know that in eternity, beyond time, this is already done. The victory's already won. The outcome is already determined. You don't have to worry about that. You just haven't, the world hasn't seen you yet. It hasn't been revealed to everyone yet. They don't know yet that the battle's over. They still think they have a shot. But they don't have a shot because it's already done. And so part of Revelation is saying to these people that are suffering in time and experiencing this persecution in time, it's God's way of saying to them, it's done. It is finished. What Jesus said on the cross is real. I want you to see that. I want you to know that. Now, of course, that's a problem because you and I, we have limited brains, right? We only see in part and know in part. We don't get everything, which is why we get symbols and images and suggestions and pictures, because we're not really capable enough to understand exactly what's in God's mind. It's beyond us. We're trapped in time. We only know what we know. One of the great misfortunes of living in the age in which we do is we've crossed some sort of barrier. For most of human history and through most of the world, they understand there are things we don't know. There are things beyond time and space. There are realities that we human beings are not going to understand. Most cultures get that, and for a majority of time, our culture got it. And then somewhere in the 17th century, 18th century, we started imagining that we could solve all the world's problems. We started this science thing, this knowledge thing. And we human beings became convinced that we can know anything there is to know because, after all, we're human beings. And so we started to convince ourselves that unless we could see it, measure it, taste it, touch it, it didn't exist. It didn't mean anything. It was all based upon us. And so science became our God. And basically, if we can't do it through science, then we have to doubt whether it is. Well, that's a minority position in terms of history and in terms of world cultures. That's a minority position, but we Westerners all bought it. We paid big money at college to learn all about it. For the world to convince us that unless science can prove it, it didn't exist. Well, Revelation is saying, oh yeah, it exists, it's real. Just because you don't know it doesn't mean it's not true. And what God is trying to do is reveal through symbols and through stories and through power what we're not going to understand. So there are things beyond our mind that we're not going to get, but he's trying to reveal these things to us in a way that helps us to understand eternity, even though it's beyond our ability to understand really. And so there's always this tension between time and eternity in this book that we're going to have to come to grasp with. So what I've essentially just argued is there's no possible way to outline this book. It's impossible. Can't be done. So with that in mind, let me tell you how we're going to outline this book. We have to do it because there are 10 sessions and I got to get through the book. And we have to do it in some sort of order. So let me propose what I'm calling our structure, but I put structure in quotes because it's not a structure. It's just the book divided into 10 sections so we can talk about it. And these are the sections we're going to go through, and I won't bore you with going through them minute by minute now, but that's really, this says 9 sessions, so we have a bonus session in there. There's actually 10. So When I first taught this, I had 9. I guess this builds in a snow day. Maybe that builds in. But again, we've already learned I'm not much of a prophet because I only picked 40 copies or 10 copies. Or whatever. All right. Let me just finish up with a couple slides here that I would like to talk about as we... what really is the point of this book? I said up front that we're not going to talk about when Jesus is coming back. We're not going to talk about the Antichrist. We're not going to talk about Russia and China and all that stuff. So what are we doing here? Like, what's the point? Like, what is the message of this? And let me suggest a couple things about what I think the central plot of this whole book is. Let me start with the plot of the Bible in general. Sometimes when I was in classes and teaching theology in the different schools, I'd have folks tell me, what do you think is the central plot of the Bible? What do you think is the central story being told there? And the way I answer that question is the words that I put up here. God will bring to conclusion his sovereign will. A holy people eternally communing with their holy God in a holy land. I mean, that's really how the Bible begins, right? Here's a holy God. He wants to create fellowship with these people. So he creates a holy people, and he puts them in this beautiful garden, a holy land. That was his desire, to be in this love relationship with his children. The same reason why you people keep having more children. Why, I don't know, but you keep doing it, because you want more relationships. And God wants more relationships with his children. He's that kind of father. He just loves these relationships. So he created these relationships. That was the opening chapter of the Bible. That's chapter 1 of the Bible. This is 1 and 2 of the Bible. It's to create this holy place where there's a holy people worshiping a holy God. And it's not holy in the sense of boring. It's holy in the sense of pure love. With no failures, with no sin, with no hurt, with no pain. It's pure, genuine, innocent love. That was the beginning. And the rest of the story is how we managed to mess that up. But we messed it up, but God says, I'm not done. I'm not done with my plan. I'm still going to have a holy people worshiping me in a holy land. It's going to happen. We keep one generation after another, keeps messing up, and we mess up, and God said, yeah, but I haven't given up on the plan. This is going to happen. And so there's another generation, and we're like, why God, why God? And he scares us once with the flood and said, yeah, I'm pretty much done with this plan. And we think the whole idea of God is over. But then he relents, and he says, no, we're going to keep the plan going, and he creates a new people called Noah. And in fact, if you follow the story, you get this cycle that I put over on the right, and I probably should have drawn it as a circle, but this cycle keeps repeating itself. The cycle of creation, and then God creates this garden, and then humanity rebels, and then God says, okay, that's it. I can't have a loving relationship for people that won't be in holiness, because, look, holiness or sin, it breaks a relationship. You can't have a loving relationship when there's sin involved. And so God judges that and says, okay, so he says to the first couple, you're out. You're not in this garden. You can't be in this perfect relation with me if you're going to chase other gods. It's not going to happen. And then God says, yeah, but I'm still not done. So he creates again. And so he lets that go on for a while, that rebellion, and then he eventually judges it in the flood, and then he starts over with Noah. There's a new creation. That works for about 10 minutes, and then his children start to go back into the cycle again. And do you get into another mess? Do you get to Genesis chapter 11? And God says, okay, all right, we're going to start again. Pick this guy from Abram. Take him out of this land of the Chaldees, over there where Babylonia is going to be, this land of sin and rebellion. And I'm going to bring him in, and I'm going to make him a holy people, and I'm going to put him in a holy land. I'm going to create a new people. That works for 10 minutes. Then that people starts spinning out of control, and they go into rebellion, and God says, okay, we got to fix this. And so they're in captivity in Egypt. But then God relents, and he says, okay, we're going to do this again, because I'm not giving up on my plan. I'm going to raise up Moses. He's going to take these people. We're going to do a new creation. We're going to take them into the promised land. We're going to start this again. We're going to have a whole new people. Lead Joshua in there. They're going to create a new country. And now at last, we're going to do this. And then by the end of Judges, they're cutting each other up and shipping out parts of bodies to one another. God says, okay, that didn't work. So he sends a prophet, Samuel, and it's the last judge. And the people say they want a king. And God says, no, you don't need a king, you need me. And they said, no, we want a king. God says, okay, I'm going to give you a king, but you're going to learn who the real king is through this king. And so eventually we get to a new kingdom under David, and that goes well for 15 minutes because he does okay. And his son is off to this great start. But by the end of his reign, we're back into the rebellion again. God watches after one generation after it gets worse and worse and worse until he sends in this country judgment, Assyria. They take out the whole 10 northern tribes. Judgment comes. But God says, you know what? I'm not done with my people. There's this small group of Judah here, this small tribe. We're going to try this again. We're going to create. There's the new kings by the name of Hezekiah and Josiah. And they're going to create a new reformation. They're going to create a new people of God. That works for 10 minutes. And then Babylon comes in. Judgment comes again. God goes silent. And we think the story is over. And then out of the wilderness, man comes and says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And God creates a new work. See, I think the book of Revelation is continuing that cycle. And it's about how that cycle ends. And God is finally going to get what God wants. And so what I would say is that the central message of this book, God's glorious victory over sin and death will one day be fully revealed to all. I think that's one point that this book is going to be. The victory is already done. But someday it's going to be fully revealed to all. Like God is going to have his holy people in a holy land to worship him for all eternity. Like God gets what God wants. In fact, more than God will get what God wants, God has already gotten it. God has already achieved it in his person, Jesus. It's just not been fully revealed yet. Which is nice to know, but how does that help us? Because we're still stuck here. It's nice that God got what he wants. When do I get what I want? Right? How do I get there? I'm still stuck here in this mess where all these screwed up people are trying to kill one another. Like, what am I supposed to do? When do I get to that holy land? And by the way, how do I get to be one of those holy people? Because last I checked, I'm not there yet. I got a ways to go. So how do we get from here to there? How do we get to eternity? How do we get to that place where we're dwelling with him with Eden again? In the meantime, we who believe, we have to remain patient. There's that word we all hate. Over and over again, we hear Revelation, just wait. Wait. We're not there yet. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Wait. And remain faithful. Don't give up. I tell people all the time, God doesn't demand total perfection. He demands faithfulness. We just have to stay faithful. Don't give up. Don't give in. Don't stop trusting. Don't stop believing. Don't start worshiping the beast. Don't start giving into the lies. Don't start giving up on the lifestyles. Don't stop believing that God did this in Christ. Don't give up. Because someday you're going to see what all the angels in heaven see. You're going to see what all those who have gone before have already seen. You're going to see the thing that you see in part now, this vision that John sees. That's going to be your daily view from your front window. You're going to join all the angels in heaven with this song, but right now, you're a witness. Right now, you're here to bear witness. In the suffering, in the trials, in the hardship, you're there to be witness because there are generations of children, his children, that don't know yet. They haven't seen eternity. but eternity is being revealed into you. The rebirth of his holy people in his holy land is being done in you. And so this story of God's grace and forgiveness and mercy, that story wins. And that to me is really the story that's at the bottom. So that we should remain patient and faithful so that we can share completely in this victory. As you and I live in this culture that's so messed up and so divided and so broken, I don't know how many times a week or a month you cry out, "How long, Lord?" I do it more than I would like to admit. And quite often in that image, I see that image in Revelation of these martyrs who are given the robe and said, "Just hang on." Hang on. Don't give up. Don't give in. Because the victory is already assured. That the outcome is already certain. I just haven't revealed it to everybody. But one day I will reveal it, and every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess. We just happen to know that now. God's revealed it to us. So we have a reason to keep living. Well, that is session 1. So hopefully what we've done is discourage you from coming back. No. Hopefully what we've done is whet your appetite to realize there is great treasure here. If we're patient, if we're willing, if we're open to what God will do, I think it will be a great deal of encouragement to us. All right, so we have a couple minutes here left over for questions. If you could just speak up because I'm old and I don't hear right. So if there are any questions, I'll repeat them and try to answer to the best of my ability. Anybody have any questions? You can wake up now. The class is over. Okay. Anyone? If not, wait, one. Do I see something? Yes.
So, I don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you
Yeah.
so much. I've studied Revelation before with different people. I think this is the most beautiful introduction I have ever heard.
Oh, thank you, Maureen. Oh, thank you. Thank you. One tries. I tell people all the time when I teach, this is just me talking about my Bible study. This is just me living my adventure. I just love the Word of God. So I appreciate you guys sharing it with me. And hopefully I'm not making up too much stuff. Hopefully it's just, Any other questions? All right. I have a class that knows everything there is to know about Revelation. That's awesome. All right. Come back next week and we will continue. And hopefully I'll have a little book that I can recommend to kind of give you a starting place. All right?
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Awesome. Good.